So today I have Dr. Philip Chase visiting my channel. I'm very honored that you are here, Philip, and I've been watching you a lot and the last years since I started to read Malazan, and now I'm very happy that you are here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Some
Like,
people, our viewers, don't know so much about you, I think, so maybe you can tell me a bit about yourself.
sure. Thank you so much, Shrikant, for inviting me here onto your channel to have a discussion about fantasy. I am, like you, a YouTuber who talks about books, particularly fantasy. And like you, I am a huge fan of the Malazan series. And that is actually, if you put all the different Malazan series by Stephen Erickson and Ian Esselmont together, I consider it all the greatest literary journey of my life. And it's just tremendous stuff. But I also love a lot of other series too. I grew up a huge fan of Tolkien's writing and have branched out a lot since starting a YouTube channel just a little over 4 years ago. I've been reading, even before that, it was a major project of mine to expand my reading in fantasy. So I've been working on that for probably a couple decades, really. But also, I am a writer, and I have recently published my own fantasy trilogy, the Edan trilogy. And that was all three books that came out last year. But I had been working on those for 18 plus years. So it was a major project in my life that has come to fruition of a sort at this point. So, but yeah, I'm a major enthusiast. And for my day job, I am an English professor. I'm actually a medievalist. So I don't have a PhD in fantasy literature, but I have a PhD in medieval literature. Which actually, for me, there's actually a lot of overlap between medieval literature and myth and that sort of thing and fantasy. So.
Yeah, wonderful, I think. Very nice to hear. Today, for the viewers, we will talk about fantasy as a maybe a genre or not. We will see. And as you've heard, Philip has a deep knowledge in this subject, so I will be happy for you, talking about the questions I have, and we will have a discussion. If you who looks at the video are interested, you can always comment and ask questions, and we'll try to answer them as best as we can, of course, later. One thing I wonder about is since you've read and also wrote fantasy now, so is there a definition of fantasy, or is it possible to sum up what fantasy is or is not, maybe?
Well, we can try.
Yeah.
It is I suppose, a genre of literature, and as such, it has much in common with other types of storytelling. For me, one of the things that sets fantasy apart is that it has a lot in common with myth. It is not myth. It is quite different in very important respects. One being myth is a common property, if you will, of a culture. It is something that is not the invention of just one individual, but these are stories that are passed on from generation to generation, and they're part of let's say, the ethos of a given culture, and they are expressions of that culture. Fantasy is an expression by an individual who, in many cases, is also very interested in myth. And fantasy seems to draw from a lot of the same archetypes, if you will, that are common in myth. So it's fairly common, for example, in fantasy to come across a mentor figure who is, very familiar in myth. But in many a fantasy story, so you have Merlin and you have Gandalf and you have Dumbledore and you have, we can go on and on. And I
Mhm.
think we all recognize that figure when we see it. So to some degree or other, fantasy is a genre that perhaps more than any other genre of literature embraces those types of archetypes or tropes, if you will. And of course, sometimes, as in an author we both admire very much, like Stephen Erickson, he'll subvert those tropes, or he'll invert those tropes, but those are still, that's still engaging with the tropes. So I think that's an important respect in which fantasy is perhaps different. It's a genre that engages more perhaps consciously with the tropes that we have inherited from myth and from older forms of storytelling. But fantasy is constantly changing. One of the really exciting things about fantasy these days is how diverse it's becoming, and how there's so many other little subgenres of fantasy, and it's but like all other forms of storytelling, fantasy is a way of making sense of our experience as human beings, as creatures of this world, and it's a way of, I think it's very valuable. Fantasy, there's a reason why people have been telling fantasy stories. If you want to expand the definition to include much older stories like the Iliad or Gilgamesh or what have you, there are fantastical elements certainly in those stories. But I think we have a need, not just for stories, but for stories that allow us to make sense of our experiences within the context of another world. And there's a term for that. It's psychic distance. And fantasy is really valuable for conferring that psychic distance to allow us to wrestle with some of the things we go through in life, but in a let's say a context that is removed from our present, and that makes it easier in some ways to wrestle with those things and then come back to our world and perhaps feel a sense of clarity in regard to them, and maybe even change the way we see our world a little bit. So yeah.
Interesting. I think the myth, fantasy, mythology, I would say spirituality, not religion. Religion is for me, it's institutionalized faith. So, I mean, especially here in Sweden. So Sweden is a very secular country. So
yes,
if you would ask 99% of the population if they believe in God, they would say probably no. Just to be safe, if someone thinks you're
they'll use
guy.
the word probably. Yeah.
But there is a scientist here. It's called David Thurfjell. He's been doing research on Swedish spirituality. Because if you come here in Christmas, everyone has Christmas trees and Christmas lights and decorations. So we've been researching what spirituality is for, Swedish or maybe Scandinavian, I would say, Scandinavian people. But the idea was then one of his conclusions, many conclusions, was that for many Swedish people, it's nature. Being in the nature, like you know a lot about folklore here and Norse mythology and things like that. I have people I know who, I'm not sure, but maybe by reading fantasy, they get this sense of mythology or spirituality, or it's like a shortcut without telling that you actually lean towards that a bit, but it opens up new worlds and, as you say, new perspectives. So I think that's interesting. I don't know how it is in the US, because US is different. I haven't been so much to the US. We are very Americanized here in Sweden, though, so we know a lot about America, but I understand that people are more into religion and faith in the United States. So maybe it's a different kind of way, situation in the United States and with the fantasy.
Well, we certainly have a much larger percentage of people who not only would say, yes, I believe in God, or I believe in a personal God, or what have you, because I personally think there's lots of different ways to go about defining God, but we won't delve into that. We're not doing theology today, but yes, you will have a much larger percentage of people who say, yes, I believe in God, and a larger percentage of people who regularly attend religious services. And so, I would say by and large, the United States is a more religious country
Mm.
than Sweden. I wouldn't say it's necessarily more spiritual though, because like you, I do distinguish between those things. But yes, that is, I think, a pretty fair assessment at the current moment for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and still some, I mean, we read fantasy for different reasons. For some, it's only the adventure or, an
Sure.
exciting story, and for some other, it could be something deeper. So it's
Yeah.
important to respect that as well. You can read it for many different reasons, fantasy, and enjoy it from different perspectives. But for you, Philip,
Yeah.
how did your fantasy journey start? I would almost say. When did you start to read fantasy? What did you read, and how did it start for you, and
The
why?
first fantasy,
Yeah.
the first it was my father who actually read fantasy, and so I inherited that from him. And the first series that I remember reading was, I think I was 11, and that was Lloyd Alexander's Prydain Chronicles. And he was very much drawing from, speaking of myth and fantasy and the intersection, he was very much drawing from Welsh myth, the Mabinogion and things like that. So that I remember being very engaged in that. But it was really, I would have to say, when I read Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings especially, that it suddenly just became my obsession, or my a great source of inspiration for me. So I was probably around 12 when I read that, and thought to myself, getting to the end of Lord of the Rings, reading the last words of Return of the King, and feeling a sense of catharsis as even as a 12-year-old kid, and not knowing what that was, but just really just relishing that, the sorrow and the joy and the beauty of that ending. And I just thought to myself, wow, I would love to be able to do that for people someday, to write a story that makes people feel the way I just felt reading this. So that's where I really got the bug, I guess. And a lot of what I consequently did really goes back to that 12-year-old boy finishing that story, I would say.
Were you? For me, in my case, we were three friends who found Lord of the Rings in the school library. We thought the cover looked
Ah,
cool. It was
okay.
a Swedish version, and then we borrowed the books and started to read, and had a kind of informal book club. I think we were 11 years old.
Ah,
Did you read it together with other people, or you read it or
no.
with your father?
Well,
Or
my father, of course,
Mm,
had read it
mm,
several times, I think, by then, but I read it by myself. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, because I think it's so interesting nowadays with this booktube thing, since I'm new here as well. I mean, when I was young, we were one of few who, liked fantasy, and I supposedly we were a bit not odd, but not all people read fantasy. Now you can connect with people on Discords or
Oh, yeah.
YouTube
It's
or anything like that, or if you have an interest, I think
yeah.
that's great. Yeah, so fantasy gave you some kind of meaning. Did you read other kind of books other than fantasy while you were exploring fantasy?
My first love was comic books,
Hmm?
actually. So Marvel, and especially Spider-Man and the X-Men, and those things. So in the late 70s to the mid 80s, I read comic books. And then fantasy was probably my next big passion after that, which has remained so. And as a kid, read a few other things like the Hardy Boys, and the things that children read, but I don't feel like they had nearly the same impact as fantasy did. So it was just a genre that spoke to me for whatever reason. And yeah, I mean, I've read now, as of course, as a medievalist, I've read a lot of other things, and through my undergraduate years and graduate school, I've read a lot of other eras in English literature, even besides medieval, but medieval literature is my wheelhouse, and that is where I like to explore as well. And I think it's a similar uh, impetus, really, in terms of what I love about fantasy tends to be what I love about medieval literature too. So I love reading Beowulf.
Mm.
and the sense of, let's say, layers in that poem. This is a poet clearly looking back on the past. It's a Christian poet looking back on his pagan ancestors in Scandinavia, in Sweden, by the way.
Mm. Mm.
The Geats or the Yeatas, or the Gotar, as they would be called there.
Yeah,
You know,
just a short input there. I think it's Götar, and
yeah,
I'm raised
Gotar.
in it's called Östergötland. It's Easter
Ah,
Gotland, you could say.
there
So
you
it's
go.
in
Yeah.
that. So yeah, Götar.
So you're running around where Beowulf was once upon a time,
Yeah.
might have, you know,
Who
if
knows?
he weren't a
Yeah.
fictional
Yeah.
character.
Yeah.
But so yeah, the beautiful thing about that poem for me is this keen sense of the past, and there's both a sense of admiration but a sense of tragedy, because you know they're gone. These people are gone, and how did they struggle to make meaning out of their brief existence? You know, this is something the poem explores. How did they make their lives meaningful? And as pagans, their answer was, Beowulf's answer was something like, "Do great deeds, so the bards will sing about you, and your descendants will hear your name," and that sort of thing. And there's something both heroic and futile about that response to mortality that is explored in the poem. And it's just this really poignant uh, appreciation, exploration of the past. And you see that all the time in fantasy. How many great fantasy books and series have a world where there is this keen sense of the past, of the peoples, some non-human, who have come and gone before the present, leaving remnants, little ghostly echoes of their lives. There's a fascination with that. So that's a big part of, I think, my fascination with medieval literature and fantasy. The one way in which they're very much tied.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, you can see resemblances in the stories. I know you had program videos about Mahabharat or
Yes.
Mahabharat.
Yeah.
So for me, that's very interesting, and also Bhagavad Gita, if I remember right now.
I have had discussions on both of them. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so for me, very interesting because of my roots. I won't talk about that now, but yeah, it's a lot of fun. I think that's difficult how to, because myth is myth, and many
Mhm.
people can believe in myth. What sometimes people, so you have to be a bit careful what you call, fantasy
Right.
stories
Yeah.
or
So at
myth.
that point, it's not myth, it's religious text,
Mm,
and it is important to make that distinction, because you mentioned the Bhagavad Gita. That's a holy text for millions of people
mm,
in the world today. It's a living, breathing religion that it's part of. So I try to be careful about that. Yeah. So it is tricky, I guess.
mm.
Where do we where do we distinguish when is it myth and when is it religious text? And
Yeah,
perhaps you know
yeah, that's another discussion, but also interesting how mythological texts came to be, how and
yep,
why, and I know there can be godsend and all that kind of things, of course, but still, it's very interesting
yeah,
because someone has written it down in these books.
yeah.
Sometimes.
And for me, there is no negative connotation whatsoever to the word myth. I'm not, that is not a word I use to dismiss a story, saying that, oh, it's just make believe or something like that. I think that there are really important capital T truths that are conveyed in myth.
Mm,
And maybe not, they're not literal, you're not supposed to believe in them literally, but I think you get a lot more from those stories when you do engage with them on several levels, and you explore how they can be telling big truths through little lies, as I think it was
mm.
Terry Pratchett who said that's what storytelling does. So, yeah.
And Beowulf is, if I remember it right now, connected to Tolkien, or he was
Well, he was inspired by
inspired
it.
by, right?
Yeah, I mean, Tolkien was a scholar of Old English, among other things. I mean, he understood Old Norse very well, and he studied Finnish, and he studied Welsh, and he studied many languages. But his real specialty was Old English, and so he is actually a really important scholar in Beowulf studies. He wrote a really key essay in terms of how we engage with the poem called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. And that remains a much read essay. It was originally a speech, but now we, of course, engage with it as an essay. And yeah, so this was his thing. And a lot of the beauty and the sorrow and that theme of life's fleetingness that you see in The Lord of the Rings, that you see in Tolkien's Middle Earth, it derives directly from Old English poetry. He's picking up on those themes and bringing them directly into his own imagined world.
I think it's interesting you're talking about Beowulf and you're talking about other texts. For me, you're a scholar in fantasy, so and you have approached this academically as well. So I'm a bit interested in how and why you came to do that, because I talked with you before we started the recording that I have another profession though, so it's not comparable, but still for me, I'm very interested in fantasy, but I have no academic degree or anything like that would make me able to pursue fantasy academically, but you have and are doing it. So how did it happen, and what made you think this genre is so interesting to delve into?
Yeah, well, again, I have to go back to that 12-year-old kid reading Lord of the Rings, I suppose. But I wanted to become a writer, and I had a chance. I met with an actual writer, guy by the name of David Budbill, who lived in Vermont, where I was at the time, and who told me, yeah, it's great that you want to be a writer, but you need a day job. You need some means of supporting yourself, because the vast majority of people who write cannot support themselves through that. That's just a tough reality, kid. Which was really great and advice, honestly. So I figured out a day job, which was, I suppose, related to my passion, my interest in being a writer of fantasy. Which is to say, I ended up, and probably it was again Tolkien's influence, sort of following in his footsteps. I had this idea that to become a fantasy writer, I had to learn a whole bunch of dead languages and fill my head with all kinds of knowledge of the past. And so I went about it becoming a writer of fantasy, and I took the scenic route, I guess you could say, which was great. It has worked for me, but. So yeah, I pursued a PhD in medieval literature with the idea that I would be able to support myself teaching, but that I would also inform my writing, and that it would become part of my imagined worlds in some way or other. So yeah, that's kind of how I went about it. It was very deliberate, I suppose, very planned course that took many, many years. But yeah, that's kind of what I did. And I also traveled. I lived in South Asia,
Mm.
and that turned out to be a very instrumental experience for me. And that wasn't originally part of the plan, but I'm so glad it happened, because it really did open me up a lot, and I think helped me to the books that I ended up writing would never have existed without that experience of living in South Asia and getting to know that culture and appreciating not just the things I have in common with people there, but the differences as well. That was a really instrumental experience for me.
Uh, how did that affect your view on fantasy or mythology? Because it's different, of course, as we know in the West
Yeah.
and in the East. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would say that it opened it up for one thing, and that in South Asia, in Hinduism specifically, but also I think to a large degree in Buddhism, and there are many types of, let's say, Buddhism there, from an actual religion to more of a philosophy, a way of living. But in South Asia in general, there's a kind of acceptance of this is the difference between the East and the West. Historically, at least in the West, we have had a tendency to insist that there can only be one truth. There can only be one way, one path to God, let's say. Whereas in the East, there's a kind of acceptance of, okay, yeah, sure, you have Jesus, we have Krishna, and these are just different paths that lead to the same goal. So that was a really cool thing for me to experience that view, that more tendency to absorb rather than to reject, I guess you could say. And that was something that I grew to appreciate. And I mean, the history of Christianity spreading in Europe is at times very bloody. And sometimes they were able to convince locals, pagans, to convert without the violence by saying, well, okay, you have these gods and goddesses. Now, if you could call them saints and you can continue to, have these little shrines or whatever. You can, so there was some compromise as well, which changed the nature of the religion in many ways. But yeah, over in South Asia, it's just a tendency to be much more accepting, I guess is one way to put it. And that is something that I appreciated a lot. And I guess when I ended up writing my trilogy, a major thing, it is in the context of a holy war, where you have the believers in one faith who are trying to impose that faith on other people who have different religions. And so I was definitely, I think, in a fantasy setting, once again, psychic distance, all that, exploring that dynamic.
That's great. I've started to read your book. I'm on page 100 now, so I'm not. I'm a slow reader. Maybe you've sensed it through Twitter or X, but I'm really
nothing wrong with that.
Enjoy. Yeah, right. So, cup of tea and a calm evening, then I get the feeling of reading. So I think the Malasan books I've been reading for 4 or 5 years now, back and forth. So I like to.
You're on your reread now, though.
Yeah, soon 100 pages left in House of Chains, so maybe tomorrow we will see. But I don't rush when I read. That's the point. So
yeah.
And for you, the viewers who know about your book, we will, I hope at least, talk about your book in another session.
Sure.
When I have read it all. So it will be interesting. One thing I noticed already about your book that we can maybe touch upon in the end, it's the names. So when I read earlier today, I was reading a book and I'm very fascinated by the names. It's since I'm interested in languages as well. Like to learn languages. Always done it since I was a small boy. Dutch, for example, when I was very small, and then now my language of birth, because of my adoption, Marathi, so Indian language. But I see the names. I'm very interested about the names because it seems like they have stems or origins, maybe from here in Scandinavia, and then it sounds like maybe German or maybe something else. I'm not sure, but I really got stuck with the names. I was writing some down earlier today.
Yeah.
I thought they were very interesting.
Well, as somebody who knows a South Asian language and a Scandinavian language, you are in a very good position to figure out what I'm doing with languages in the trilogy. And if you progress, you'll see even more. The languages, just to be brief about it, are based on real world languages that I do know. So including Old English and Old Norse and Welsh and Nepali. And I have, that doesn't show up so much in the first book unless you're looking at place names. But I do have places in the trilogy where a person, the POV, doesn't know the language that is being spoken by other people. And so it's the language, and someone who knows Nepali or Hindi would be able to probably figure out what's being said. It's a kind of garbled form of Nepali, whereas there are moments when there's a language that's being spoken that is more based on Old Norse, or maybe a kind of a Proto-Germanic, or Welsh or some. So yeah, those are definitely in there. I do have a very huge fascination with linguistics and language change and all of that. So that's also a part of what I'm doing in there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Good teaser to continue the read, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing I'm curious about is that you have been teaching fantasy in academically. So I'm interested, tell me a bit about what you teach and yeah, your perception of or experience of doing that as well.
Well, specifically in regard to fantasy, I have taught actually graduate courses on Tolkien and on Tolkien sources, his medieval sources and mythological sources and that sort of thing. But my regular job is at a community college, and so I do teach composition there, and I teach intro to literature. I teach medieval and Renaissance literature. And I invented a course called Fantasy Novels. I was allowed to create this course, and that is a course that I've taught quite a few times at my college. And it's been the most fun, really, to engage with students. And people who sign up for that course are signing up because they love fantasy, and so we get in some great conversations. I have had semesters where I've tried to make it's sort of theme based. So there was, for example, a semester where we did colonialization as a theme in fantasy. And so, as you can imagine, Gardens of the Moon was one of the books we read. R.F. Kuang's The Poppy War was another one, and N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy, the first book, the fifth season. So these kinds of books, and it was just a way to look at colonialism through a fantasy lens, and it was brilliant. It worked really well. So yeah, that's kind of the course in a nutshell. And I've changed up which books I've selected each semester according to what kind of theme are we going with this semester.
Well, sounds great. We should have something like that here in Sweden, I think.
Oh yeah, I'm sure it'd probably be hopefully a popular course. Yeah.
Yeah. The students you had, the books you chose, were the books new for them, or how did they react? Because there are some classics in fantasy, of course, as we know, the people
Yeah.
have read.
Mostly, yeah. Most of if I've done semesters where we've done Harry Potter, and maybe that's the one that most students would have read. But most of the students are new to most of the books, I would say. And sometimes they are fantasy readers, but they just haven't quite tried some of the older ones yet. So I've read Tolkien, of course, in the course, and Ursula Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea. These are slightly older. They would have heard of them maybe, but never actually read them. So, because the younger generations, they've maybe seen the Lord of the Rings films, but they're more likely to have seen the films than to have read the books. At this point. So, but
And how the course do they get some kind of degree, or do they write an essay or present something?
yeah, research paper. They do presentations, and the course is part of their degree. So they have, for every degree, there's required courses, and then there are electives and the students have some freedom to explore when they're doing their electives. So if a student is interested in the literature course, they can do a literature course. If they want to do philosophy, they can do philosophy. But it counts as a humanities elective, essentially. And it allows them it's part of their degree. Yep.
What do, I mean, I'm curious about, the students when they go to your courses, and what do they write about, for example?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, if depending on the semester and the themes we're talking about, There are all kinds of different approaches that I've seen over time. And some of the students come up with brilliant topics on their papers. But so you could look at Ursula Le Guin's The Wizard of Earthsea and explore how she infuses that story with the philosophy of Taoism. So that's an example of a topic that I've seen is the Taoism as expressed in A Wizard of Earthsea. Or you could look at, American Gods by Neil Gaiman, and as an exploration of American identity or the lack thereof. That's another example. Or I mentioned the colonialism topic and how certain authors have portrayed colonialism in their work, and what insights that might shed on real world colonialism and that sort of thing. So yeah, just an infinite number of possible
Yeah,
topics. Yeah.
great. I think to take part of the perspectives, because when you read fantasy, I mean, you and I, we can have different connotations when we read fantasy. So it can trigger a lot of things from real life or about
Oh yeah.
real politics or philosophy or anything like that. You don't know what a person will feel like when they read a fantasy.
So true. Yeah.
Yesterday I saw Lord of the Rings with my daughter. We've seen it many times, so it's
Okay.
at home. Yeah. And there is a scene where Sam, I think it's in the book as well. He stops before leaving the Shire and says, "If I take one step more, I will, have gone the furthest I've ever been outside." Yeah. So there are things that can give you emotions and trigger emotions. Really.
Oh, for sure.
Different
For
people.
sure. Yeah, many of my favorite authors are very good at turning on the tears. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a cathartic
Hmm.
experience. It's really fantastic. I think we need that actually, honestly. I think we have stories for a reason. We are the storytelling creature, and these serve a very important emotional and intellectual purpose for us. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I'm reading House of Chains. When you reread it, you see more things, but you also get more deeper, I think, into, at least for me, my feelings and emotions.
I completely agree.
Ericsson's writing, how he writes both emotions, but also I think his archaeological background shines forth even more when he writes about Raraku and Raraku.
Sure.
Yeah, right. The layers, what could be under the sand.
There's those layers again. Yeah.
That's fine. Great. One thing I was curious about as well is we talked about before we started recording, if there is a fantasy, canon or classics, or especially from the aspect that you have a course on fantasy. It's interesting to listen to if you have some, must reads or at least should reads. And we talked a little bit earlier as well about that the number of fantasy books today are huge, so it can be very difficult for people to know where to start.
Yeah. I mean, it's impossible to read every book, personally for me, that I want to read in this genre. My PhD dissertation was actually focusing on a chap named William Morris, who you could argue, now I wouldn't say he was the first to write what we now call fantasy, but he was one of the early ones, and he wrote these, what they are called prose romances back in the 1890s. And they were very much based on his engagement with Icelandic sagas and medieval material and that sort of thing. Now, George MacDonald is one person who preceded him, and you could argue, it depends on how you define fantasy, but really, I think fantasy as a modern genre emerges in the 19th century as largely a reaction against industrialization and to some degree capitalism. It is an escape from the ugliness of the present in some sense, and expresses a yearning for a more, now probably imagined, but more beautiful, pristine past. Um, and also a past where the relations between people were more meaningful. A past where there were, again, this is very much idealized, but the idea that everyone in older societies had a place and that people took care of each other, in contrast to an industrialized capitalist society where people were uncaring and there's just a lot of suffering that goes unaddressed. So it's really a genre that in many ways is engaging with the past and is drawing from much older stories, but as an almost conscious expression of discontent with the present. And that continues with writers like Tolkien. And you have many writers in the early 20th century, like Lord Dunsany and E.R. Edison and many others. And then, of course, you have the Robert Howard with the Conan and all of that going on here. Slightly different, the sword and sorcery branch, I guess you could say, of fantasy, which is a little bit different from the epic fantasy type thing that you have Tolkien doing. But to me, these are all currents feeding into the same river, essentially, but with maybe slightly different motives and agendas. But yeah, I mean, there's just so many. I can't even begin to name. But yeah, and it's, of course it's really blown up these days, which is wonderful to me. I love the diversity that you can find in the genre today. It's just tremendous, and I'm perpetually, you know, trying to trying to catch up to all the authors that I want to read, and it's just impossible. But that's a good problem to have overall, I would say. But yeah, if you want to explore the origins of the genre, that is doable, I think. But as you get further and further, it becomes harder and harder to read all the authors who really should be read. I mean, you have so many throughout the 20th century, and so many who left an important influence on the genre, like Ursula Le Guin, one of my heroes. In the late 60s and in the 70s, she's writing the Earthsea books and doing something different, bringing a feminist lens to fantasy in the later, not in the Wizard of Earthsea so much, but in the later Earthsea books. So that was an important milestone in the genre, and a way of expanding the genre, which I really appreciate myself. But yeah, you just can't read everybody that deserves to be read. It's just not possible.
I think we have to become like the Greek philosophers, maybe have a society, not like that, of course, but where you can only study, for example, maybe then.
Yeah.
But for many people, it's not possible. I read Ursula K. Le Guin, The Left Hand of Darkness for many,
Oh, yes, sort of
many
science
years.
fiction. Yeah. Yeah.
That's I remember it still quite clearly, and it had obviously a feminist approach to a lot of things,
Right.
bearing child, for example. So that's one on my TBR list. Since I'm a slow reader, I think I have a TBR list for a lifetime already. We
I
will
do
see.
too. Yeah. Yeah.
But that's great. I'm reading the Iliad, as you know, at the moment, and
Yeah.
I think
Brilliant.
that's interesting because that's Stephen Erickson who has, and partly you,
I
I
was
would
just
say.
gonna say you must be seeing some Malazan parallels in there in terms of the machinations of the gods and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot. On the surface level, it's names, it's the number of short stories in the big story, and also how they intervene, and that they are unreliable and all very confused, I would say. Some of them, at
Yep.
least. They seem
Yep. And yeah, very wily and manipulative as well, the gods. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how it is. You can read a lot of fantasy. Basically, you can, if you watch this video, you can pick any fantasy you like, and you can start from there. I would say, if you go into a bookshop today, there are hundreds of fantasy books. So just pick one you like. You mentioned earlier, Philip, that you, when you were small, you read comics.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading comics as well. I still do, but how do you, I mean, very short, but how do you view comics in relation to books and fantasy and yeah, as a story
Yeah,
way of telling stories, I would say.
there's some overlap, I think. I read superhero comics as a kid, and I'm actually currently reading Neil Gaiman's Sandman,
Mhm,
which
mhm,
is tremendous storytelling. But yeah, it's a medium that, like fantasy, encourages, I think, the imagination. And obviously, things happen in comic books that cannot happen in our world.
mm,
Um, but they function, I think, similarly as a source of escape, which is wonderful because we need that, but also as a way to think about the things that we go through in our world. So comic books can take on some really serious themes, as in the Sandman, but
mhm,
also even in those superhero comics, the X-Men or
mm,
Spider-Man or what have you, they can take on some heavy themes in there. And for a kid, trying to survive, let's say middle school,
mm, mm, mm,
they were a wonderful escape, but they're also a great way to work out some of the things that you're going through. And I think that that's a very important function. So they have that in common. I would absolutely argue that comics are a form of storytelling that provides many of the same important functions that more sophisticated, if you will, more adult,
mhm,
whatever you want to call it, forms of storytelling provide. And they're fun as well,
mm. Yeah, I'm reading. I'm at volume 3 of Sandman. I read the
Cool.
two first, the omnibus, I think it's called, right? The
Yeah.
compilation. So I'm about to
Yeah.
start the third, but at the moment I'm reading Swamp Thing. I don't know if you read it by Alan Moore.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm familiar with Swamp
Mm,
Thing. Yeah.
right. So I think they have. I mean, Neil Gaiman has read. I wrote the preface to the second volume of Swamp Thing,
Oh,
at least
cool.
a re-release of the Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
Good, Philip. As you viewers know, these videos that I have is not. Sometimes they're long and sometimes they will be short. I think this is for YouTube standard a short video on BookTube. So I'm
Well,
happy
BookTube
to.
may be short, but for YouTube, it's long, I would say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. So we'll see. That's very true. I hope, Philip, that you want to come back to me and talk, especially about your
Absolutely.
book.
I'd be delighted. Yeah.
And I'm, of course, very happy that you have visited me today. So thank you very much.
Well, it's a huge pleasure, Shrikant, and I love talking with my fellow book lovers, and we have this shared passion. But also, I think it's fair to say that when we come together as a community, we learn from each other and we enhance our experiences with stories. So I'm always learning from people I interact with here in the classroom, and I'm just so grateful for that. So thank you so much for inviting me for this. I really appreciate it.